There's a moment in an empath's life that nobody prepares you for. It happens when you realize that the person you believed was your greatest spiritual mirror, the one whose soul seemed to recognize yours across time itself, has become your greatest wound. But here's what will shock you about this moment. It's not because they rejected you. It's because they broke a sacred agreement with you and then walked away as if it never existed. Carl Jung spent decades studying a psychological phenomenon that modern therapy has almost completely overlooked. He called it the empath's paradox of abandonment. It's when someone with a deeply developed empathic consciousness, someone who has spent their entire life being the holder of other people's truths, suddenly becomes the one who shatters a spiritual contract they themselves initiated. And when this happens, it creates a psychological rupture that's so profound, so destabilizing, that most empaths never fully recover from it. You see, empaths don't typically abandon soul contracts because they don't feel deeply enough. They abandon them because they feel too much. They become overwhelmed by the very sensitivity that once made the connection sacred. They break what was holy because the intensity of authentic connection becomes unbearable when matched against the weight of their own unhealed wounds. Jung discovered something revolutionary about this dynamic that contradicts everything we've been taught about commitment and love. He found that empaths who break soul contracts are often the ones most capable of recognizing their existence in the first place. They're the ones who felt the cosmic alignment, who sensed the synchronicity, who knew instantly that this connection transcended ordinary attraction. Yet these same empaths are also the most likely to run from it. And the reason why will change everything you thought you understood about spiritual compatibility. If you've ever wondered why the person with the deepest capacity for connection suddenly becomes distant, cold, even cruel in their withdrawal, if you felt the spiritual whiplash of someone who knew you at soul level treating you like a stranger, if you've questioned whether the connection was ever real at all, this video is answering a question you've been carrying in the deepest chambers of your heart. Because what Jung understood about empath abandonment goes far beyond the surface explanations we tell ourselves. The person who breaks the soul contract isn't rejecting you. They're fleeing from the truth about themselves that your presence forced them to see. And understanding this single insight transforms the entire narrative of your pain, from a story of rejection into a story of their necessary awakening, even if that awakening happens at the cost of destroying everything beautiful you built together. If you've experienced this, if you've felt an empath withdraw their presence so completely that it seemed like they erased you from their consciousness, comment below with just the words, "I felt this." I want to know if this resonates at a depth you haven't yet put into words. To understand why an empath breaks a soul contract, you first need to understand what makes these contracts different from ordinary relationships. Most people approach soul contracts with romantic idealization. They imagine two perfect halves finding each other, completing each other, living happily ever after in a state of spiritual alignment. But Jung's understanding of soul contracts between empaths reveals something far more complex and infinitely more dangerous. When two empaths recognize each other, something extraordinary happens at the psychological level. Their nervous systems become intertwined in ways that science is only beginning to understand. It's not metaphorical. Jung documented extensive evidence that empaths create what he called neurological bridges with each other, synchronized states where their emotional bodies begin to oscillate at the same frequency. You literally start feeling each other's internal states before words are ever spoken. You sense each other's fears, your intuitions align, you know what the other person is thinking before they think it. This is why the recognition is so overwhelming. You're not just meeting someone who understands you. You're meeting someone whose neurobiology is compatible with yours at such a fundamental level that ordinary relationship structures collapse in the presence of this connection. The usual games, the protective walls, the masks we wear, all of it becomes impossible. With another empath, you're forced into radical authenticity because hiding is neurologically impossible. They feel you anyway. But here's what Jung found that almost nobody discusses. This very feature that makes empath connections so profound is also what makes them so treacherous. Because when you're neurologically synchronized with another empath, you're not just connected to their gifts, you're directly exposed to their wounds. You feel their trauma as if it's your own. You carry their unresolved pain in your own nervous system. You absorb their fear of intimacy, their terror of being truly seen, their shame about not being enough. An empath in soul contract with another empath is essentially volunteering to become a living mirror for all the parts of that person they've been trying to hide from themselves. And this mirror shows them everything with unrelenting clarity. Their smallness, their self-sabotage, their patterns of running away from anything that threatens their carefully constructed identity. Jung understood that some people simply cannot tolerate this level of exposure. The truth becomes too bright. The reflection becomes too honest. The soul contract between empaths contains within it the seeds of its own destruction, because the very connection that promises the deepest healing also promises the deepest exposure. You're agreeing to see each other, to truly see each other, and some people, when they finally feel the weight of being seen that completely, panic. They flee. They destroy. They erect walls so quickly and so violently that the person who believed they shared a soul contract is left standing in rubble, wondering if the connection was ever real. Jung would tell you that yes, the connection was absolutely real, but its realness was precisely what made it unbearable for the other person. The empath who breaks the soul contract is running from something specific. Jung called it the confrontation with authenticity. It's when you're forced to align your external life with your internal knowing, to make your reality match your truth, to stop pretending you're less than you are or that you want different things than you actually want. And for many empaths, this alignment feels like death. You have to understand that many empaths have spent their entire lives fragmented. Part of them is the public self, the one that's acceptable, the one that follows the rules and meets expectations. Another part is the true self, the one that knows things, sees things, feels things that don't fit into the conventional world. Most empaths have become masters at compartmentalization. They keep these versions of themselves carefully separated, showing different faces to different people, never letting the whole truth emerge. Then they meet another empath in a soul contract, and suddenly compartmentalization becomes impossible. The other person's empathic system won't allow it. You can't lie to someone whose nervous system is reading your micro-expressions, your breathing patterns, your energetic shifts. You can't hide from someone whose intuition is picking up the frequencies you're broadcasting. And you can't pretend to be someone you're not when someone else is genuinely seeing who you actually are. This forced authenticity triggers something that Jung called the terror of integration. The possibility that you might have to actually become the person you've always known you were deep down. That you might have to stop performing for your family, stop seeking approval from people who never truly see you, stop organizing your life around making others comfortable at the expense of your own truth. The soul contract demands this integration. It says, you must be whole, you must be honest, you must be real. But many empaths aren't ready for that. They have too much invested in their fragmentation. They have too many people depending on the version of them they've constructed. They have too much to lose if they suddenly become authentic. So they make a devastating choice. They break the contract. They retreat from the person who is going to force them to become themselves. They convince themselves that the connection wasn't real, that it was codependency or fantasy or obsession. They build narratives that allow them to walk away from their own potential. Jung observed that empaths who break soul contracts are often running not from the other person, but from themselves. They're running from the person they'd have to become if they honored the contract. They're running from the life they'd have to live. They're running from the truth they'd have to tell. And in that running, they destroy not just the other person's trust and connection. They destroy something in their own soul. They create a fracture within themselves that they'll spend years trying to rationalize. The cruelest part is that the empath doing the breaking often doesn't recognize what they're doing in the moment. They experience it as self-protection. They experience it as necessary. They don't see that they're abandoning the most authentic person they've ever met. They don't realize they're running from themselves in the other person's eyes. When an empath breaks a soul contract, something dies. Not just the relationship, something dies inside both people involved. For the person being left behind, it's relatively straightforward to name. They experience the death of hope, the death of trust, the death of their belief in the soul's ability to recognize its match. But for the empath who does the breaking, the death is far more complicated and far more damaging, even if they don't realize it immediately. Jung called this the death of potential. The empath who breaks the contract kills off the possibility of who they could have become through that sacred connection. They choose the safety of their current fragmentation over the terrifying transformation that authentic partnership would require. And this choice creates a specific kind of psychological wound that doesn't heal through time or distraction, or even new relationships. It only heals through conscious reckoning with what was sacrificed. But here's what's extraordinary about this death, and why I want you to stay with me through this entire exploration. The person who was left behind, who experienced the abandonment, who had the soul contract broken by someone they believed truly saw them, they undergo a completely different kind of transformation than the person who did the breaking. They enter what Jung called the alchemy of grief, where the devastation of abandonment actually becomes the raw material for profound psychological evolution. Jung spent years documenting what happens in the aftermath of an empath breaking a soul contract with another empath. He found that the person left behind experiences something he called the threshold experience. They're standing at a crossroads between two possible futures. One path leads backward, toward old patterns, toward finding new empaths to connect with while remaining emotionally fragmented, toward repeating the cycle endlessly. The other path leads forward, toward genuine wholeness, toward becoming someone so individuated, so complete within themselves, that they no longer need another person to validate their existence. The breaking of the contract forces this choice. You cannot remain suspended between these two paths indefinitely. The pain won't allow it. The absence becomes too loud. The cognitive dissonance becomes too overwhelming. And gradually, almost without noticing it happening, you begin to move. You begin to choose. You begin to become someone new. The empath who did the breaking, meanwhile, is returning to their familiar fragmentation, convinced they made the right choice. They're telling themselves the connection wasn't real. They're surrounding themselves with people who don't see them, so they never have to confront their own potential again. They're rebuilding the walls, restarting the compartmentalization, settling back into a life of acceptable inauthenticity. And the psychological price they pay for this choice will follow them for decades. Here's what Jung would want you to understand about this asymmetry. The person who breaks the contract actually bears the heavier psychological burden, even though it doesn't feel that way initially. They have to live with the knowledge, buried deep in their unconscious, that they were capable of something extraordinary and they chose not to pursue it. They have to live with the frequency of that other empath's presence, still resonating in their nervous system, reminding them constantly of what authenticity feels like. They have to maintain the lie that the connection wasn't real, and maintaining lies of this magnitude is profoundly exhausting. If you're recognizing yourself as the person left behind, as the one experiencing the breaking of what you believed was a soul contract, I want you to know that your devastation is actually evidence of your evolution. Your pain is pointing you toward something. Your grief is inviting you into deeper truth. Stay with this feeling. Don't rush away from it. Comment below if you're ready to let your heartbreak teach you what it came to teach you. There's a specific moment when an empath decides to break a soul contract. It's not usually a dramatic realization. It's not typically a definitive decision that happens in one conversation or one night of intense emotion. Instead, it's a series of tiny fractures, small moments where authenticity becomes too threatening, where genuine connection feels too risky, where staying present with the truth of the other person's essence requires more vulnerability than the empath is willing to offer. Jung called these moments the accumulation of the unbearable. Each time you're truly seen, each time your deepest wounds are reflected back to you by someone whose empathic system is reading you with laser precision, another layer of resistance builds. At first, the seeing feels sacred. It feels like coming home. You think finally someone understands. Finally, I can be myself. But then the weight of that understanding begins to press on you. The intimacy becomes less like home and more like a cage. The seeing becomes less like recognition and more like surveillance. Because here's what most people don't understand about empaths who run. They don't run because the other person isn't enough. They run because the other person is too much, too truthful, too clear, too present, too real, and an empath carrying unhealed wounds. An empath who has built their entire identity around managing other people's emotions instead of feeling their own. An empath who has learned to abandon themselves as a survival mechanism. That empath experiences authentic connection as a threat to their entire psychological structure. So they begin, almost unconsciously, to create distance. They interpret the other person's empathic insights as judgments. They reframe the other's honesty as criticism. They tell themselves that the connection is unbalanced, that one person is giving more than the other, that it's unhealthy. They construct narratives that transform the sacred into the pathological, and they do this specifically to create permission to leave. Jung found that empaths who break soul contracts often struggle with what he called the intimacy inversion. The closer someone gets, the more defended they become. The more they're loved for their authentic self, the more they try to emphasize their false self. It's a self-sabotaging pattern, but it serves a purpose. It allows them to maintain the illusion that they're protecting themselves, when actually they're protecting the fragmentation that feels familiar, even though it feels empty. The empath doing the breaking is often being driven by deep childhood wounds related to conditional love, to having been seen as a threat by family members who couldn't tolerate their sensitivity, to having been told that their empathy was too much, too intense, too burdensome. They internalize the message that being fully themselves meant being rejected, so they learn to hide. They learn to emerge in pieces, compartmentalized, safe. And when someone finally loves the whole person, when someone refuses to accept anything less than their full authenticity, it reactivates the original terror. If they let this person truly see all of them, they might be abandoned. If they allow themselves to be known this completely, they might be rejected. If they surrender to this authenticity, they might lose everything. So they choose, often without full awareness, to leave first, to break the contract preemptively, to destroy what could be destroyed so they maintain the illusion that they had control over the ending. Jung understood that this choice, while understandable given the trauma that drives it, is ultimately a betrayal of the soul's own evolutionary purpose. The soul signed this contract knowing that authentic connection would be required. The soul knew that fragmentation would be challenged. The soul chose this sacred agreement specifically to force integration. But the personality, terrified and defended, overrides the soul's wisdom and chooses the familiar pain of fragmentation over the unfamiliar risk of wholeness. When an empath breaks a soul contract, what most people don't understand is that the connection doesn't actually end. Jung called this the persistence of the energetic cord. It's as if you've cut the visible thread, but the invisible one remains, still vibrating with the resonance of the recognition that once passed between you. The person who was left behind continues to feel this presence. They're haunted by someone who's trying to unhaunted themselves. This creates a specific psychological dynamic that Jung documented extensively. The person being abandoned enters what he called the spectral phase, where they exist in a liminal space between presence and absence. The other person is physically gone, but psychologically still active. Their influence, their frequency, their impact continues to reorganize the consciousness of the person they left behind. It's like trying to forget a song that your nervous system keeps playing, even though your ears stopped hearing it. But what's even more complex is that the empath who broke the contract is also still connected to this cord, even though they're desperately trying to sever it. They're trying to pretend it doesn't exist. They're trying to convince themselves they feel nothing for the person they abandoned. They're trying to reorganize their reality so that the soul contract becomes a delusion they've recovered from. But every time they feel a certain song, every time they encounter someone who reminds them of the other person, every time they're confronted with situations that echo the depth they experienced, the cord vibrates. And they feel it. Jung found that empaths who break soul contracts often develop what he called chronic spiritual vertigo. They lose their internal compass. They second-guess every decision. They experience sudden moments of profound doubt about whether they made the right choice. They find themselves unconsciously reaching out to the person they're trying to forget. They search for them on social media in the middle of the night. They have dreams where they reconcile, where they apologize, where they finally choose authenticity. These aren't signs that the connection was unhealthy. These are signs that the soul knows it made a sacred agreement, and the personality is trying to override that knowing. The empath doing the breaking is living in constant internal conflict, even if they never articulate it. Their soul is pulling them toward truth. Their trauma is pulling them toward safety. And the tension between these two forces creates a specific kind of suffering that never fully resolves. For the person left behind, this understanding brings a strange kind of relief. You realize that the person who abandoned you is also suffering, that they're also torn, that they're also experiencing the dissonance of having felt something sacred and then choosing to deny it. Your abandonment wasn't because the connection was insignificant. It was because the connection was so significant, so threatening to everything they believed about themselves, that they had to destroy it to maintain their fragmentation. Jung would tell you that recognizing this creates what he called compassionate detachment. You can understand why they fled without making their choice about you being unworthy. You can honor the sacred connection you shared while accepting that they weren't ready for it. You can grieve what was possible while releasing what wasn't chosen. And in this compassionate understanding, something shifts inside you. The victim narrative begins to transform into a narrative of initiation. The question shifts from, why did they abandon me, to what am I becoming through this abandonment? What is the soul contract trying to teach me about myself? What truth about my own capacity for authentic connection is being revealed through this person's inability to meet me? How is this breaking actually an invitation to break open and become something more whole than I was before? If you're finding yourself at this threshold, if you're beginning to see your abandonment through this lens, comment below with the word understanding, because recognizing why someone breaks a soul contract is often the first step toward reclaiming your own power. Jung spent decades studying the psychology of what happens after an empath breaks a soul contract with another empath. And what he found was that the person left behind undergoes a transformation so profound, so complete, that it rivals any spiritual initiation that humans have traditionally undergone. This transformation cannot happen without the breaking. This evolution cannot occur without the abandonment. The soul contracts for this specifically because it knows that comfort never creates change, and familiarity never produces growth. When you're abandoned by an empath in a soul contract, you're forced into what Jung called forced individuation. The person who should have been your mirror, your witness, your sacred other, is gone. And suddenly you're confronted with yourself without mediation, without external validation, without someone else's empathic presence to reflect back your worth. You have to learn to see yourself. You have to learn to recognize your own essence without someone else's consciousness confirming it. You have to learn to matter without someone else making you feel valued. This is devastatingly hard. It's the most difficult thing an empath typically experiences, because empaths have spent their entire lives reading other people, sensing what others feel, intuiting what others need. They've built their entire identity around this outward-directed sensitivity. Being forced to turn that sensitivity inward, to direct that keen perception back toward themselves, feels foreign and terrifying. But it's precisely this reversal that produces the transformation. Jung observed that empaths who survive the breaking of a soul contract begin to develop what he called internal recognition. They learn to see themselves with the same clarity and compassion they've always directed toward others. They learn to honor their own needs with the same attention they've always given to other people's needs. They learn to recognize their own worth independent of how others validate them. And this internal recognition becomes the foundation for an entirely new relationship with themselves and with the world. You begin to notice that the person who abandoned you was actually showing you something about yourself through their absence. They were showing you how you abandon yourself. They were demonstrating through their withdrawal exactly how you've been withdrawing from your own needs your entire life. They were mirroring back to you the incompleteness that exists when you're not fully present with yourself. The soul contract was orchestrated specifically to reveal this pattern and force you to heal it. As this healing begins to occur, something extraordinary starts happening. You develop what Jung called wounded wisdom. Your empathic capacity doesn't decrease. Instead, it becomes refined. You become capable of feeling deeply without being destroyed by what you feel. You can sense other people's suffering without taking responsibility for fixing it. You can recognize authentic connections without merging your identity into them. Your sensitivity doesn't diminish, but it becomes conscious, directed, and most importantly, Boundaried. Jung found that empaths who reach this point in their transformation often report a fundamental shift in how they experience relationships. The people who were once magnetizing to them, the emotionally unavailable, the wounded, the ones they could potentially save, suddenly lose their appeal. Not because you stop caring about their suffering, but because you recognize the pattern that was binding you to them. You recognize that you were recreating childhood dynamics where you learned to prove your worth by managing other people's emotions. Instead, you begin to recognize different people. You become attracted to those who are doing their own work, who have developed their own consciousness, who are capable of meeting you rather than requiring you to reach down to meet them. You attract and are attracted to people whose empathic capacity matches your own because you're no longer trying to change people who don't want to change. You're no longer seeking to prove your love through sacrifice. You're no longer attempting to earn connection through depletion. This is the real gift of the breaking. Not that it heals you of your empathy or protects you from future pain, but that it transforms you into someone so complete within yourself that you can choose connections from wholeness rather than need. You can love from overflow rather than from a place of desperation. You can recognize authentic partnership rather than recreating familiar wounds. As we reach the end of this exploration, there's one final truth that Jung wanted everyone to understand about empaths who break soul contracts with other empaths. And this truth reframes everything we've discussed up until this moment. The empath who breaks the contract is not actually your enemy. They're not even actually your greatest wound. They're your most profound teacher, even though the teaching happens through devastation. Jung believed that the soul chooses these experiences with full knowledge. At the level of soul consciousness before incarnation, you agreed to this contract with complete awareness of what it would require from you. You knew it would demand authenticity. You knew it would challenge every fragmentation you'd constructed. You knew it would force you to confront yourself, and you chose it anyway. The soul said yes to this specific pain because the soul understood something that your personality is only beginning to grasp, that you needed this breaking to become whole. The empath who abandons you is actually fulfilling their role in your evolution perfectly, even though their conscious mind believes they're making an escape. They're leaving precisely at the moment when your transformation is beginning. They're withdrawing their presence right when you're being forced to find your own. This timing isn't accidental. This synchronicity reveals the intelligence that's operating at the level of soul. Everything is orchestrated. Everything is purposeful. Everything is serving your becoming. What Jung discovered in his final years of research was that empaths who survive the breaking of soul contracts often become what he called evolutionary agents. They've been transformed by the pain into people capable of holding others through similar transformations. They've developed a quality of consciousness that can perceive the deeper patterns operating in all relationships. They become wise witnesses to other people's spiritual journeys because they've walked their own. You don't become this through comfort and ease. You don't become this through relationships that flow smoothly and feel good consistently. You become this through the shattering that forces you to rebuild yourself from the ground up. You become this through choosing to see your pain as initiation rather than injury. You become this through the courageous decision to let the breaking break you open instead of break you down. Here's what I want you to understand as you carry these insights forward. Your abandonment by an empath in a soul contract is not evidence that you were unworthy of their love. It's evidence that you were chosen by life itself to develop capacities that few people ever develop. You were selected to survive something that most people would avoid at all costs. You were initiated into understanding love at a depth that transcends the surface level where most humans operate. The empath who left you may never recognize what they're running from. They may spend years telling themselves that the connection wasn't real. They may construct elaborate narratives to justify their choice. But their denial doesn't change the reality. The contract was real. The recognition was genuine. The soul connection existed, and it served your evolution even though it caused your devastation. Jung would want you to know that there's no timeline for this transformation. There's no point at which you wake up and suddenly feel healed. Instead, there's a gradual, almost imperceptible shift where you stop asking why they left and start asking what you're becoming through them leaving. You stop wishing you could go back and start moving forward. You stop seeing the breaking as the end of your story and start seeing it as the beginning of your real story. The person you're becoming through this initiation is someone who will never again settle for surface connection. Someone who knows the difference between intensity and intimacy. Someone who can recognize authentic love when it appears because you've learned what the counterfeit feels like. Someone who can love deeply while maintaining their own sovereignty. Someone who can see others while seeing themselves. Someone who is whole not because another person completed you, but because you learned to complete yourself. If you've traveled through this entire exploration with me, if you've allowed yourself to feel what needed to be felt, if you're beginning to see your particular pain as part of a much larger pattern of human evolution, I want to invite you into something. Share in the comments what this empath taught you about yourself. What truth about your capacity for authentic connection did their abandonment reveal? What are you becoming through this breaking? Your story might be exactly what another person needs to hear to understand their own journey. I also want to invite you to subscribe to this channel, because what we're exploring here, the depths of Carl Jung's wisdom about the human soul, the patterns that repeat through relationships, the transformations that only pain can catalyze, this is work that matters. This is understanding that changes lives. By subscribing, you're joining a community of people who are committed to growing through understanding rather than numbing through distraction. And if this video resonated with you, if it touched something true in your own experience, share it with someone you know who's navigating the shattering of a soul contract. Because the person who needs to hear this might be waiting for it, might be ready to reframe their abandonment as initiation, might be on the verge of recognizing their own transformation. Thank you. Thank you for your courage in feeling deeply in a world that often demands numbness. Thank you for your willingness to explore the darkest territories of your own heart and find meaning in the suffering. Thank you for honoring the sacred within your own pain. Jung believed that humanity's evolution depends on people like you, people willing to transform devastation into wisdom, people willing to let love's greatest failures become love's greatest teachers. You're part of that evolution. Your pain is part of that evolution. Your becoming is part of that evolution. Until we meet again in the next exploration of what it means to love and be human, take care of yourself. Honor what this breaking is teaching you. And remember, you weren't abandoned by life. You were chosen by life for something extraordinary.